Good day. Today is Wednesday, 27th August 2025, and today I'm going to say that we are in that period, a period of relative calm before the great storms in the autumn start to hit us. Relative calm in geopolitical terms. I remain of the view, clear view, that there is a high likelihood that we're going to see a renewed conflict in the Middle East between Israel and Iran in the autumn. There is, by the way, an interesting article in Foreign Policy, which I notice makes exactly the identical claim. It too believes that a conflict between Israel and Iran this autumn is a very high probability. So we have conflict likely between Iran and Israel. I suspect that the great drama, the real crisis about the situation in Gaza will hit home fully in the autumn as well. And we now have big rumblings of financial crises in Britain and in France. Now, in Britain, as I discussed in a recent program, there's been a warning from a set of economists that Britain could find itself quite quickly, maybe as soon as this autumn, in a major crisis in the bond markets, one which will oblige it to do what it did back in 1976 and turn to the International Monetary Fund for a bailout. Now, I'm not going to discuss this warning in detail. On the Duran, Alex Christoforou and I have done a detailed program, a long program, in which I have discussed the situation in the British economy in detail. I made a particular point, which when I touched on this topic a few days ago on this channel, was not yet clear. I said in this program that given the extraordinary cataclysmic nature of the warning from the economists, one might have expected strong denials that this was going to happen from the Prime Minister, the Chancellor, and the Governor of the Bank of England. Strong public denials, but to my astonishment and indeed dismay, these have not truly come. Instead, what we have had are mumbled denials and basically attempts to bury the entire story, which leads me to think that there is quietly a great deal of concern within the government in Whitehall about the state of things, and that it might be as bad, every bit as bad as those economists say. I want to stress, I don't know this for a fact. Nobody in government obviously speaks to me. Nobody in Whitehall at that level speaks to me either. So this is just a statement of opinion. It is not a statement based on knowledge. But the fact of the relative silence about the warning from the economists, I would say, speaks for itself. Anyway, that is extraordinary and alarming in itself. But we have now had an almost identical warning about the situation in France from none other than France's finance minister. The French government, the government appointed by Emmanuel Macron, is trying to pilot through the parliament an incredibly controversial budget, one which is seeking to deliver very significant cuts in spending on France's very large social welfare budget. And to say that this budget is controversial would be an understatement. Marine Le Pen's National Rally has said that there is no electoral or political mandate for a budget like this, and they will vote it down. And the group, led somewhat uncertainly by Jean-Luc Mélenchon, I say uncertainly because I get the sense that some of its members are perhaps not fully signed up to Mélenchon's view of things. Anyway, they're saying they're going to vote against this budget as well, in which case the likelihood is that the budget will fail. The government is presenting this as a vote of confidence. If the budget is lost, the government will then have to resign, and France will be without a government. President Macron, in theory, has the option of calling new parliamentary elections. We're now a year away from the parliamentary elections he called last year, which resulted in a debacle for his party and the emergence of Mélenchon's grouping as the biggest grouping in the French Parliament, though the largest percentage of the vote was indeed won by Marine Le Pen's National Rally, which is the third biggest group in terms of parliamentary deputies. I discussed all of this in detail when it happened last year, and of course we also did dedicated programs about it on the Duran. Anyway, the point here is that Macron cannot build a stable majority in the French Parliament. The parliamentary elections last year deprived him of that majority. He's made various attempts to peel support away from Mélenchon. These have been successful up to a point, but even now, the government that he appointed, the one that's trying to pass this budget, does not have a real majority in the French National Assembly. So a year has passed under French law that should mean that entitles Macron to call fresh parliamentary elections. One might have thought that in a situation where the government cannot pass a budget, calling elections would be the right thing to do in order to create a stable majority and thus a government. But Macron refuses to do it because he worries that if he were to call such an election now, the runaway winner would be Marine Le Pen's National Rally. And the last thing he wants in the last year that he is in office, which will be 2026, is to find himself in a period of political cohabitation with a prime minister from Marine Le Pen's National Rally, commanding a government with a stable majority in the French National Assembly, which will of course marginalise Macron's ability to manoeuvre in the last year of his presidency. So for the moment, he is refusing to call elections. So France looks like it's heading for political and economic deadlock. And surprise to surprise, the French finance minister is saying that in light of this, if the government loses the vote, which I believe is due on the 8th of September, if the budget is voted down and the government loses the vote of confidence and is forced to resign, then this could create a financial crisis, a situation in the bond markets, and that could oblige France to turn to the International Monetary Fund for a bailout or a loan. I'm going to say something here, which is that, of course, if that were to happen, it would be a huge crisis. It would increase the prospects, by the way, of a financial crisis in Britain. If France was visibly going down, Britain, which in some respects is in a rather similar fiscal position to France, in some ways it's better. Debt to GDP ratio in France is worse than in Britain. It's higher than in Britain. But in other respects, by the way, the situation in France continues to be somewhat better than in Britain, though it's pretty bad in both countries. Anyway, the point is, if there is that kind of a crisis in France in September, my guess is that there is a risk of contagion. There's already talk about Britain needing an IMF bailout in the autumn as well. If France, as I said, faces that kind of crisis, the possibility of Britain finding itself in a similar crisis is heightened. However, there is an important difference, which is, of course, that France is in the European Union and it is also in the Eurozone. So if there is a major crisis in the bond markets, the European institutions, the European Central Bank, the European Commission, and of course Germany will all want to have a say about what goes on in France. And if there's any question of a bailout of France, the Germans certainly will want to be involved. Now, a bailout of France is a massive proposition. It's a much bigger proposition than a bailout of, say, Greece or Italy or Spain were, as was true at the time of the Euro crisis back in 2008 to 2012. I mean, this would be on an entirely different scale. And as we know, Germany's fiscal room is diminishing rapidly as well. Chancellor Merz has embarked on a massive program of increasing debt levels in Germany, principally to fund his Ukrainian friends, to rearm Germany, as he says, and to improve German infrastructure. A project which already, to me, looks like it's going to fail on every single count. But I think the Germans, nonetheless, will not want the International Monetary Fund involved in France without Germany having a say in what happens. They will also want to be involved. They will try also to force terms upon France, and inevitably that is going to cost Germany. Reducing Merz's fiscal headspace, his fiscal maneuver room, further still, in fact, dramatically so. And just to complete this, I cannot imagine anything more inflammatory in terms of relations within the European Union as a situation in which the Germans come along and demand that France makes cuts to its social welfare spending. Well, anything more inflammatory than that. The sense of outrage and humiliation and resentment in France, if the Germans were to come along and make those sort of demands, well, I just can't even begin to imagine what would happen. If all of these things play out in that kind of way, then potentially we would be looking not just at a major financial crisis in Europe with simultaneous bailouts in Britain and France, but conceivably the biggest rupture that the European Union and the Eurozone in particular have experienced ever since the Treaty of Rome and the establishment of the European Economic Community way back in, I think it was 1960. So this is the prospect that the French finance minister is now warning us about. Now, to be clear, I don't know whether all of this is true. Again, just as I don't know whether there is going to be a financial crisis and a bailout in Britain in the autumn. I don't know that there is going to be a financial crisis and a bailout of France, even if the budget is rejected and the government falls this autumn. The other possibility, which we should not ignore, is that Macron, who has apparently played with the possibility of resigning early as French president, admitting that events have overwhelmed him, that he might resign in this situation rather than be the president of France in the middle of a crisis, and that could lead to elections and conceivably to the emergence of a new president who would presumably come from the National Rally, and a new majority in the French National Assembly. If a candidate from the National Rally, Marine Le Pen or someone else, wins the presidency, I am guessing that they would immediately call new parliamentary elections, which would probably lead to a majority for the National Rally in the French Parliament. That would at least provide a government in France with a mandate and a majority and a stable parliamentary, a stable position in the French Parliament. And who knows, the return of some degree of political stability might conceivably avoid all of these crises that I'm talking about. Or it could be that, just as the economists who wrote about the risks of a financial crisis in Britain are overstating the reality, it could be that for his own reasons the French finance minister is doing the same in France. Though I have to say, the idea of a finance minister, him calling into question the credit worthiness of his own country, astonishes me. But anyway, we will see. But we are looking at very, very complex situation in Europe, potentially in the autumn. As I said, we don't know how all of this is going to play out. We have a possible problem in Britain. Certainly, there's a lot of talk about higher taxes in Britain, and the government there is losing support, hemorrhaging support by the day, and we are looking at an even more dramatic crisis potentially in France. Now, I am going to say this: if there is a crisis in Britain and there is a crisis in France, and if this crisis starts to affect the entire European Union and the Eurozone, then I cannot see how that crisis cannot spill over, at least in some form, to the United States. And there's concerns about the budget situation there. And of course, there's also concerns about the sustainability of the current boom in the stock market, which I am not going to discuss now. So, a difficult autumn, potentially, on the financial and economic fronts. I am not an expert in predictions of economic questions. I don't work in the financial services industries. I am not an economist, thank goodness. So, you don't have to go along with these opinions, and they are opinions only. But I would defy anyone to come forward and say, based on what people in Britain and France are saying, that the situation in either of these countries is good. On the contrary, it is far from good, and it is deteriorating. Meanwhile, turning back to Germany, I read a very interesting article in Eurointelligence, a very interesting magazine, by the way. I believe Wolfgang Monschau, whom I've often spoken about, and whom I consider an extremely intelligent man, is the presiding intellect behind this magazine. It is, by the way, very difficult to subscribe to. You have to contact them directly and arrange in person for a subscription. But anyway, there's an interesting piece there about Friedrich Merz, and how Friedrich Merz, the Chancellor of Germany, the man who campaigned to deal with the growing domestic problems of Germany, has now become Germany's foreign policy Chancellor. He is primarily interested in foreign policy. He has little interest, or so it seems, in other things. And Germany's foreign policy chancellor, and the article makes the point that Merz made a rare appearance in Germany to announce that he's now pushing for structural reforms, but then it pointed out that he has no actual real plan for any of these structural reforms, even as he talks about Germany's welfare budget being unsustainable. Though, as I pointed out in previous programs, that doesn't prevent him from assigning 9 billion euros a year to supporting Ukraine. And then, after making these points about Germany needing structural reforms and how he's going to be committed to them, we learn that I take this again from this article in Eurointelligence, that he dashes off to Moldova, spends 2 days in France to attend a bilateral Franco-German cabinet meeting. He's talking incessantly about foreign policy. His primary objective seems to be pushing back against Russia. That seems to be what interests him most. And of course, supporting his friends in Ukraine. And we are told that, in contrast to other German leaders who have carried out significant structural reforms, and this article references, for example, Gerhard Schröder, who carried out very controversial, but some people consider successful, reforms in Germany, economic reforms in Germany in the early 2000s. I am, by the way, unconvinced about the narrative of the success of those reforms, but never mind. Anyway, Eurointelligence points out that, unlike Schröder, Merz does not have a reform agenda. He has stump speeches. He wants to cut the welfare roll, but as the article points out, that is obviously unacceptable to his coalition partner, the SPD. And I think that just about sums the situation in Germany up. There is no economic plan in Germany. The Chancellor, for all that he set himself up before he became Chancellor as the man with the plan who was going to turn Germany round and bringing it back to the system which caused Germany to thrive under Konrad Adenauer and Ludwig Erhard, the people who authored the German miracle of the 1950s and 60s. Anyway, Merz presented himself as the person who would do all of these things, very much like Keir Starmer. In practice, he shows no interest in it. His primary concern is foreign policy. It is Ukraine. It is, in fact, Russia. And we now read in the New York Times that he's busy trying to persuade members of his coalition cabinet that the right and clever and really intelligent thing for Germany to do would be to send peacekeeping forces to Ukraine after the conflict has ended and there is a ceasefire. In other words, for Germany to join the coalition, Starmer's and Macron's coalition of the willing. So there it is. That's Merz's brilliant plan at the moment. Again, as in the case of Macron and Starmer, it comes up with complete uninterest in and lack of knowledge of the dire reality of today's German armed forces. And of course, there's even less acceptance of this idea in Germany itself. The New York Times article says, with extraordinary understatement that this whole proposal is received without enthusiasm by Merz's own members of Merz's own CDU party, or by much of the wider German public. On the contrary, I suspect that if this proposal is ever trotted out in earnest, it is going to encounter strong opposition from German society and especially from young people. The same, by the way, is true of this whole coalition of the willing idea in Britain and France. And certainly in Britain, and by the way, I believe also in France, the militaries are very, very unenthusiastic about this idea altogether. But anyway, Merz is not worried about the fact that Germany's economy is contracting for the third year in succession. He's more interested, or so it seems to me, in refighting the two world wars with the Russians all over again, without, of course, quite the same ideology or perspectives. He wants to renew the perennial conflict with the Russians, to roll them back, and he appears to believe that this is the mission he has been called to fulfill. As I said, it seems most extraordinary to me, but anyway, there it is. If there is a financial crisis in Europe, in France and Britain in a few months' time, then I'm going to say that Merz is going to have his hands full trying to deal with that, something he looks completely inadequate to do, by the way. Anyway, he's going to have his hands full with that, and I think at that point, any further ideas of adventures in Ukraine, which, by the way, will enrage the Russians, the idea of German troops re-entering these territories, I think is going to provoke an immensely strong reaction in Russia, given the past history. But anyway, if anything like that were to happen, that there were to be a financial crisis in Europe, I don't think even Merz would have the time or the ability to even float these proposals anymore, because they would have been completely overwhelmed by events. So, to repeat again, we are quite plausibly in the quiet before the storm. A storm in the Middle East, a storm potentially in the financial markets as well, with the epicenter perhaps being in Europe, but with a real risk of contagion to the United States as well. So we must be, at least I am going to be, prepared for all of these possibilities. And yes, I accept that they are possibilities. They are never certainties. We will see what happens. Now, just before I leave this topic, I would say one further thing. I mentioned how Keir Starmer's government is hemorrhaging support by the day. Emmanuel Macron, I think, is now sinking to the same levels of unpopularity as his immediate predecessor, Francois Hollande. Merz, whom I've just been talking about, is also losing support. The AfD is now, by some opinion polls, the most popular party in Germany. Yet, it seems that Merz, far from wanting to learn from this, is indeed going to join up with his friends, Macron and Starmer. It seems that this is a new collective union of bankrupt and unpopular political leaders, but they all seem to want to flock together and stick together, presumably so they can all sink together. I still find this so strange. It is so unlike my whole understanding of conventional politics, that it baffles me, but there it is. Now, I've talked about the storm clouds, but of course there is the immediate proximate storm cloud, which is the situation in Ukraine. And here again, I want to say, I've said this so many times now that of course I'm repeating myself, but I'm going to say it again. The frenetic diplomacy that took place in August between the United States and Russia and the United States and Ukraine has now effectively ended. There's only been one solid outcome from it, which is that the United States has dropped its earlier demand that there be a ceasefire in Ukraine and that this ceasefire be agreed soon. The president, Donald Trump, confuses everybody by continuing to give contradictory signals about where he is going. So yesterday, for example, he made more critical comments about Russia. He spoke about how he would be very unhappy if nothing came of the diplomatic initiative, if he got the sense that the Russians were obstructing moves towards peace. He would not hesitate to impose massive tariffs and sanctions upon them. And it's perhaps worth pointing out that today, as I understand it, the 50% tariffs against India come into effect. And there was a long article in the Financial Times which discussed these tariffs, and by the way, which seems to confirm the analysis that has been provided previously by that commentator in Naked Capitalism, that in fact the primary target of the tariffs, the tariffs against India, is India's gemstone industry, its diamond cutting industry, with which, of course, Indian Prime Minister Modi has a strong personal interest and connection. Anyway, the president continues to give contradictory signals. So about a week ago, the United States refused to back a statement, a routine statement published every year by the Western powers, criticizing Russia's actions during the 2008 war between Georgia and Russia. This was the 5-day war that took place then. By the way, I'm not going to discuss the Western narrative about the war. It has now become mainstream in the West that this was a war of aggression that Russia waged against Georgia, that ignores a massive analysis of the origins of the war commissioned by the European Union itself, which demonstrated quite clearly that the war was started by then President of Georgia, Saakashvili's government, and which, of course, when I went to Georgia, I found that it was universally accepted by pretty much everybody I spoke to in Georgia that it was indeed Saakashvili, not Russia, who started that war. But the Western narrative is different. And every year they've been issuing a statement criticizing the Russians for their aggressive war against Georgia. This time, the United States resiled from the statement. An unusual step, and an interesting one, and clearly consequent upon the improvement in the mood between the United States and Russia that follows from the Alaska summit. And going back to those comments of Donald Trump, of course, he bracketed criticisms of Russia with criticisms of Zelensky. Zelensky also, it seems, is partly to blame for the situation, or potentially to blame for the situation. And the president left it open that if he got the sense that Zelensky was the cause of the failure of moves towards peace, or he might get angry with him. There are, however, all of those threats of tariffs and sanctions. There's talk about more arms deliveries to Ukraine. There's reports all over the media about those Iran missiles that I spoke about 2 or 3 programs ago. Now, when I spoke about them before, I understood that these were surface-to-air missiles, apparently rather simple and cheap missiles, and I speculated that they were intended to shoot down, get down drones. It turns out that that's not actually the case, that they are missiles, air-to-surface missiles, cheaper, much cheaper than Storm Shadows and Scalp missiles, which can be launched by fighter jets and which have some stealth and other capabilities and which can be used against the Russians. And supposedly the United States has authorized the supply of 3,500 of these missiles to Ukraine at a cost of $800 million. Now, there's a number of things to say here. President Trump has been going out of his way to insist that the United States is no longer providing or spending any money on Ukraine. It's not spending money on supplying weapons to Ukraine. It is no longer providing money for Ukraine's civilian economy. Presumably then, this $800 million bill for these missiles is going to be paid ultimately by the Europeans. I mean, that's the logic of what Trump is saying. Now, I would say quickly, I've already said this before, but I'm going to quickly add that despite the president's protestations, I believe that some money from American taxpayers is indeed still going to Ukraine. For example, money that is being transferred to Ukraine as part of its lending program by the International Monetary Fund. Just saying. But presumably, the money for these missiles is going to come from Europe. Now, the problem I have with this is that I'm not actually clear whether these missiles even exist, whether we're talking about missiles that have already been produced or which are going to be placed in production, or whether this is just a project to develop these missiles. There's even some uncertainty, I've noticed in some of the articles, as what the exact designation of these missiles is. Perhaps some of you who follow these things can clarify all of this for me, but I've read various articles about this purported missile delivery, and well, like a pointillist painting, the closer you get to the detail, the more obscure the story becomes. So it could be that there is actually a genuine quantity of missiles that are about to be delivered to Ukraine. The Belgians are apparently saying that they're about to deliver another batch of F-16s to Ukraine. The F-16s, which, by the way, have proved an almost complete failure. Just saying, they are already operating over the Ukrainian skies, but they don't seem to be making any difference. They're certainly not engaging the Russian Air Force in any way. And the Ukrainians themselves admit that they are completely outmatched by Russia's Sukhoi fighter jets. Just saying. But anyway, the Belgians are about to supply apparently some more F-16s. We're not quite sure how many. And it could be that these missiles are going to be supplied and are going to be operated by these F-16 jets. It's possible. Or it could be that this is a project and that the missiles have not yet been fully designed or placed in production, and it will be years before any of them turn up, by which point the war will, of course, be over. Either of these possibilities, it seems to me, on the basis of what I have read, could be equally true. I don't know which it is. But anyway, talk about supplying these missiles to Ukraine is obviously not going to be seen by the Russians as a friendly gesture. And then, however, we read other things, that the Americans and the Russians are apparently now in detailed talks about energy cooperation. We learned that Igor Sechin, the all-powerful head of Rosneft, Russia's biggest state-owned, by the way, oil company, one which has a rather infamous reputation in the West because it is based in part on the U.S. holdings that the Russian state nationalized in the early 2000s at the height of the Khodorkovsky affair. I'm not going to go into the details. Anyway, it seems that Sechin has had various meetings with senior officials of Exxon, the big American energy company, the big oil major. Apparently they've met in Doha. Interestingly enough, it's perhaps worth pointing out that Sechin is sanctioned. So he is a sanctioned individual, and if he's sanctioned, American business people perhaps shouldn't be meeting with him, but it seems that they are. And there's talk about Exxon returning to Russia, resuming its work in Sakhalin, and that's an island off Russia's Far East where there was a major project, liquefied natural gas project and oil project as well. Anyway, Exxon might want to return there. All of those Exxon assets, by the way, were confiscated by the Russian authorities, but the Exxon apparently wants to negotiate their return. And of course, before the 2014 crisis, Exxon also had a major stake, or wanted to establish itself in oil and gas exploration projects in the Russian Arctic. Now, all of this, presumably, is conditional on some kind of agreement between Russia and the United States, which would involve the lifting of sanctions. Now, President Trump and other US officials have linked that kind of agreement to an ending of the conflict in Ukraine. But there is no sign at the moment of an ending of the conflict in Ukraine. And Exxon, which I happen to know is an extremely well-informed company, must know that. So, why then are they meeting with the Russians and talking to them? So all of this is going on. There's all these contacts between the Americans and the Russians taking place. None of this leading anywhere very far. And as I said, the president himself giving and encouraging contradictory signals. The link up, a potential link up between Exxon and Rosneft, between the American and Russian oil industries, would, by the way, make perfect economic sense from the president's point of view. We discussed it recently in a live stream that we did on the Duran with the American lawyer, the American attorney, Robert Barnes, that Trump, for political and economic reasons, wants a stable oil price, that this is of paramount importance for him to achieve his various objectives. And that cannot be guaranteed if one of the big three oil producers and exporters, which is of course Russia, is not involved in some way and does not play ball on this topic with the United States. So we have all of these contradictory signals going on. The Americans making negative signals, continuing to threaten the Russians with sanctions, continuing to talk about arms deliveries to Ukraine, new exotic air-to-surface missiles. The Americans at the same time pulling back from supporting statements in the United Nations critical of Russia, and undertaking secret discussions or semi-secret discussions with the Russian oil industry about future energy cooperation. Now, there are three theories about American behavior here. Theory one is that the President of the United States knows exactly what he's doing, that he wants to extricate the United States from unwinnable and indeed lost war in Ukraine, that he understands the importance of a strong relationship with Russia for the United States, for all the reasons that I said and others as well, and that this is his real priority. That is what the summit in Alaska ultimately was all about. And all of the unfriendly signals towards Russia, the sanctions and the threats of sanctions and the tariffs and the threats of tariffs and the arms deliveries to Ukraine and all of that, these are cover to execute that plan, to cover to fool and delude the Europeans and the neocons in the United States. So that's one view. There is the other view, which is the diametrically opposite one, which is that the president secretly is himself, if not a neocon, at least someone who is as hostile to Russia as the entire mainstream in the United States, that this is all an elaborate plan, a cunning plan to fool the Russians by pretending to be nice to them, to agree to a freezing of the conflict and security guarantees to Ukraine and ultimate NATO membership for Ukraine, and that all the friendly gestures to Russia, the meeting of the oil executives, the failure to support this statement, that all of this is a subterfuge to trick the Russians into doing these things. There is the third view, which is mine, which is that the president himself is unable to make up his mind. Intellectually, I think he does understand that some kind of rapprochement with Russia is essential. He has also spoken recently about the need for some kind of work with the Russians to bring the nuclear arms race under control. I have discussed this in many programs. I've spoken about the alarming prospect that in February next year, the START treaty ends and that we could find ourselves for the first time since the 1960s in a world where there is no arms control treaties in existence and no negotiations of any arms control treaties in existence. The president does seem alive to the enormous dangers of this. So I think most of his mind, part of his mind, understands the need for a rapprochement with the Russians. He understands that the conflict in Ukraine was a disastrous mistake by the United States and by the collective West, that some kind of dialogue and understanding with the Russians is essential, and preferably that there should be a wider economic partnership with them, at least on a limited level as well. But I think at the same time, the president remains intimidated and in awe of all the enormously powerful people from the deep state, the neocons and all the others that surround him. He remains nervous of the Europeans. He is also very worried about looking weak. He remembers the extraordinary damage, political damage, he suffered in his first term when it was suggested that he and Putin were in some kind of collusion with each other. And I think these two things constantly balance each other out and interfere with a clear determination of policy. So he doesn't consistently work towards a rapprochement with the Russians, and he doesn't work towards a clear policy of confrontation with the Russians either. He oscillates constantly between the two, and of course that makes it very difficult for people like me to understand what his long-term policies are. In the end, I think, as I said, that deep down he does understand that the war is lost and that a rapprochement with Russia is needed. There were reports about a week ago that he had told his senior officials that Ukraine was losing the war. He realized that Ukraine was losing the war, and that the only way that a peace could be achieved was if Zelensky finally made the substantive concessions to the Russians that the Russians were seeking, that the war would, in other words, have to end on Russia's terms. But he doesn't seem to be able to come out and say this publicly and to break with Zelensky in the way that, if he really does have that understanding, he would need to do. So we are left with all of this uncertainty, a sense that the United States is gradually tiptoeing away from the wall, but no clean break, something which encourages the Ukrainians to keep going, something which gives Zelensky confidence that ultimately he will never be brought to heel, and something which of course leads the Europeans to go on throwing money at Zelensky and Ukraine on a scale that I find unbelievable. We've done again another program about this on the Duran, and my colleague and friend Alex Christoforou has discussed this at length on one of his programs. Anyway, the Europeans are continuing to do that without showing any recognition or understanding that they're throwing money into what by now is a lost cause. Anyway, the Russians, meanwhile, watch and wait. I think that they feel deep down that it's all but inconceivable now that Trump will indeed follow through with his sanctions and tariff threats. The 50-day deadline that Trump gave a few weeks ago, I don't think anybody takes that seriously anymore. And of course the deadline, the other deadline, the 8th of August, has now passed. There's no sign of any further action in sight. I think for the moment the Russians don't believe that this is going to happen. They don't believe if the Graham Blumenthal bill ever does get its past the Senate, that it will ever be brought into full effect. And they probably calculate that even if it is, they can ride it out. And in the meantime, they sense, I suspect, Trump's own uncertainty and the fragility of his position. They are probably, at least some level, aware of the economic fragilities in Europe. They're confident in the strength of their friends and the loyalty of their friends, they're about to have this big meeting with them in Tianjin in China, and their primary focus at the moment is prosecuting the war. They got what they wanted, the Americans to drop the demand for a ceasefire, and that leaves matters open for them to prosecute the war. And it is to the war that I will now come. Now, in my previous program, I said that we would probably, after this pause in information about the situation in Pokrovsk in particular, we would probably start to get information which would show that the Russians were indeed pressing forward in various places. And, well, we haven't had a deluge of information over the last 24 hours. I sense that the Russians are still holding information back, but we are indeed starting to get some information. Some of it coming, by the way, from Ukrainian sources. So the first is a video which shows a Ukrainian tank, probably a Leopard 2. I know that there are some Leopard 2s in Pokrovsk. A Ukrainian tank operating in the Shakhtarsky micro-district in southwest Pokrovsk. This is the main fortified area of the town. It's where the big the big high-rise apartment buildings, the big Soviet apartment buildings, natural fortresses in many places are located. And this tank moved towards one of these apartment buildings at the southernmost, westernmost tip of the Shakhtarsky micro-district and started to shell this big building, this apartment building. And we could see the apartment building being in part destroyed. The point is that for the Leopard tank to be doing that, that building must have been under Russian control. Now, that all but confirms that the Russians have established a presence of some kind in the Shakhtarsky micro-district. It's perhaps too soon to say that this is the start of a storming operation of the Shakhtarsky micro-district. As I said, the key fortified position of the Ukrainians in Pokrovsk, it could have been a reconnaissance group that had managed to sneak into the Shakhtarsky micro-district and had managed to occupy this building. Just saying. But there is a possibility that the Russians have indeed broken into the Shakhtarsky micro-district and a storming operation has now begun. There are also reports, and again these are coming from Ukrainian sources mostly, that the Russians have expanded the area of control that they have in the village of Rodinska, north of Pokrovsk. This is the village, discussed it many times, which sits alongside the main supply road, what was the main supply road, leading into Pokrovsk for the north. This supply road is by now completely unusable. The Russians are much too close to it. There is no possibility that supplies can be entering Pokrovsk using this road. But if Rodinska is captured by the Russians, then the Russians are in a very, very strong position. They can enlarge whatever territory they control west of the road. Redovka, the Russian newspaper, implied that they do have some presence already west of this main supply road. And that would bring the Russians closer to the E50 road that leads into Pokrovsk from the west. And it's often said that this is the main road that the Ukrainians now use to send their supplies. If Rodinska were to fall, the Russians would be in a better position to cut this road securely and, in effect, to place all Ukrainian troops inside Pokrovsk into a cauldron. Now, that's the battle that's apparently going on there, and the Russians are gaining ground in Rodinsk. There are also reports that the Russians, who, according to various reports, have been in Mirnograd, this is the big western industrial suburb of Pokrovsk. There are reports that the Russians have enlarged either the territory they control in Mirnograd itself or positions that they have around Mirnograd, and that the position of the Ukrainian troops in Mirnograd is indeed deteriorating. And there's been another picture, another video film, which the Ukrainians have published, which shows two Russian soldiers walking along a road. I believe this is south of Mirnograd, towards Pokrovsk itself, from what I can tell. I'm not good at reading maps. But anyway, they seem to be walking along this road without apparently much care. They obviously assume that this is territory that the Russian army controls. And anyway, this is territory which the mapping projects up to now have assumed is under Ukrainian control. Now, as it happens, those two soldiers were then ambushed by what the Ukrainians admit was a raiding party, which suggests that overall the Russians do indeed control this territory. Anyway, suffice to say that this is territory that had previously been believed to be under Ukrainian control, but clearly the Russians have more than a presence on it. Probably they actually control it. So all of this suggests a deteriorating situation for the Ukrainians in Pokrovsk, and that video footage of the Leopard tank shelling the building in the Shakhtarsky micro-district might point to an actual storming operation of Pokrovsk itself. Now, the other thing that we know has been happening, and about which there is now footage, is that the Russians have been bombing Dobropilia, the town located to the northwest of Pokrovsk. They've recently been bombing it heavily. When I say bombing, this is fab bombs launched against Dobropilia by the Russian Air Force, Sukhoi 34 fighter bombers. And of course these are huge bombs, and we know that they can inflict massive damage. So bombing is taking place in Dobropilia, and a bridge that linked Dobropilia with Pokrovsk, and which apparently was used to send supplies to Pokrovsk, has been destroyed. Now, that suggests that the Russians are taking further steps now to close the supply roads leading into Pokrovsk, to cut off Pokrovsk from supplies, which may suggest that the storming operations in Mirnograd, the Shakhtarsky micro-district, and Rodinsk are indeed underway, and that the Russians perhaps are anticipating the capture of Rodinsk fairly soon. Rodinsk gets supplied from Dobropilia, and that perhaps this attack on this bridge points to a bigger storming operation in Pokrovsk itself. It's all, for the moment, fragmentary. I suspect that we're going to get a lot more news over the next couple of days. There's further news that the Russians are now edging closer towards the village of Shakhove, to the northeast of Pokrovsk, broadening the breakthrough area significantly. If it's captured, then, as I said, this will probably mark a major decisive change in the contours of the battle. But I am starting to get the sense that we moved in Pokrovsk possibly away from a situation that existed until a few days ago of attrition, of the Russians drawing Ukrainian reserves to the Pokrovsk area and then attritioning them with special forces groups carrying out ambushes, with Rubicon drones, with bombing, that we're now moving from that point towards a possible outright attempt to storm these locations, Mirnograd, Shakhtarsky microdistrict, and Rodinska, preparatory to a final storming and eventual capture of Pokrovsk. Again, to repeat a point I make many times, I am not there. I do not know. It may be that I'm completely wrong about all of this. As I said, the information is still fragmentary. I'm trying to put the pieces together. It's quite possible that I'm putting them together wrongly. We shall just have to wait and see. What is, I think, widely acknowledged is that southwest of Pokrovsk, the Russian advance towards the Dnieper continues. The Ukrainian counterattacks in that area seem to have been brushed aside. The Ukrainians are now admitting that the Russians have captured positions inside Dnipropetrovsk region. This is the first admission about that from the Ukrainians. It came yesterday. The Russians, of course, have confirmed that they've been present in Dnipropetrovsk region for some weeks now, but the Ukrainians up to now have been denying it. Anyway, the Russians pushing gradually further west towards the river. It doesn't seem as if the Ukrainians are in much of a position to resist the Russians. And I discussed yesterday the critical situation the Ukrainians are facing in Kupiansk, Liman, Konstantinovka. I'm not going to add anything to that. More interesting, or rather more suggestive, are reports, increasing reports, which are now starting to point towards a possible Russian attempt to recapture the city of Kherson, to conduct some kind of amphibious operation across the river. Now, Saldo, the Russian-appointed governor of Kherson region, has recently said that the Russians have completed all the preparations for an amphibious operation to recapture the city of Kherson. All that remains is an order. Now, what is interesting, and what I think hardly anybody has noticed, is that Saldo also has just had a meeting in the Kremlin with no less a person than Putin himself. And the meeting was about the economic and social situation in Kherson region. At least that's what the Kremlin readout tells us. But I noticed that it was only a readout, not a transcript, and it's quite likely that they discussed other things, perhaps military operations as well. I don't know. Anyway, one thing is indisputable. Firstly, that there are a large number of Russian troops now concentrated on the east bank of the river, opposite Kherson city, but then they have been there for a long time. But it seems that the Russian footprint west of the river is growing, and the Russians are now regularly bombing the main road leading into Kherson from Nikolaev, the city of Kherson from Nikolaev. Apparently most of these attacks have been done by long-range drones. Presumably the Rubicon group are active here as well. And there's actually pictures, video film, of burnt-out vehicles, Ukrainian vehicles, on these roads, which, by the way, otherwise look deserted it's clear that civilians no longer travel along these roads to any extent anymore. And it could be that the Russians are again suffocating or trying to suffocate supplies to the Ukrainian forces in Kherson, preparatory to some kind of amphibious operation. Now, I have to say that an amphibious operation, even across a river, so late in the summer, does seem somewhat surprising to me. Presumably, it could be done in late August or September, just saying. I mean, there's still a few weeks. But after that, of course, come October, we will get the period of the autumn rains and of the Rasputitsa, the swamps. I would have thought this was an odd time to launch an amphibious operation myself. There would be a serious risk that the water levels in the river would rise and that the water itself would become more choppy. And it might be difficult to maintain supplies to any Russian troops who establish a foothold in Kherson, in the city of Kherson itself. Having said that, no military that I know of has as much experience of cross-river operations as the Russians. They carried out many of them during the Second World War. They've rehearsed doing that many times since. Perhaps they're also planning to build bridges across the river. They could probably build bridges across the river, though these would presumably be pontoon bridges and they'd need to be heavily defended. Though perhaps the Russians could defend them. Anyway, we shall see. If the Russians, of course, do capture even part of the city of Kherson, this will aggravate Ukraine's crisis. Every day I read on the Ukrainian channels about Ukraine's shortages of supplies, of men, of drones, of armoured vehicles, of shells. I've received what I consider to be authoritative reports that there's barely any Ukrainian artillery still operating east of the Dnieper, that Ukraine suffers from a major shortage now of artillery pieces, and that the Ukrainians can no longer risk deploying artillery pieces east of the river because they're so short of them, and the Russian drone operators have become so skilled in destroying them, and the Russian counter-battery systems are now so effective that they would quickly lose them, with the risk that they would run out of artillery altogether. But anyway, that's the information that I've been getting about the artillery positions. But anyway, the Ukrainians, short of men, machines, drones, if an entirely new front is opened by the Russians on the west bank of the Dnieper in Kherson region, this would not only be a massive prestige blow for Ukraine, it would also be a major operational crisis. But as I said, I'm not sure that the Russians really do have this plan. There are reasons why I think it might be a complicated thing to try so late in the summer. But then, as I said, what do I know? Anyway, all of this is going on, and probably the main front for the moment, the place to focus on, is Pokrovsk and Konstantinovka, that area. Though the area of Kupiansk, Siversk, Liman is also an area of crisis for Ukraine. I don't actually know any part of the contact line which is not properly described as an area of crisis for Ukraine. And of course, perhaps the Ukrainians have not adjusted to the fact, but the hope of a ceasefire that perhaps kept their hopes going earlier in this year has now gone away. I suspect that the more this sinks in, the more they come to realize that there is not going to be any end to the fighting, the more difficult for them it's going to be. I said in a recent program that it seemed to me that after a brief fillip of optimism caused by Zelensky's actually empty but publicly successful meeting with Trump in Washington, with all the European leaders in attendance, and after the claims about a successful containment by the Ukrainians of the Russian breakthrough in the Pokrovsk area, I said in a recent program that after this slight burst of optimism, I was starting to get the sense that the mood in Ukraine amongst the bloggers and Telegram channels and people like that was becoming worse again. I get even more of a feeling about that, and have got even more of a feeling about that over the last couple of days. And of course, if the situation in Pokrovsk is indeed deteriorating in the same way I said, if there really is a storming operation of Pokrovsk underway, then that sense of gloom is going to get much deeper still. I spent much of the first part of this program talking about a potential series of crises in the autumn, renewed conflict in the Middle East, a financial crisis in Europe, a military crisis for the West in Ukraine is a real possibility as well. I wonder how the Western leaders, the European leaders, will deal with it. I don't get the sense that they have any idea of it or any plan. For some of them, even as the economic situation collapses all around them, I suspect that the thing that they're going to continue to worry about most is the collapse, potentially, in places like Konstantinovka and Pokrovsk. In some ways, it's bizarre, but there it is. A solution, perhaps, to all of these problems that I've set out, actually is there. Opening discussions with the Russians, sending a properly authorized representative to Moscow to meet with Lavrov and Putin, relaxing the sanctions, accepting that oil and gas deliveries from Russia will have to resume. All of this probably would stabilize the situation ahead of the stormy autumn, which I believe is coming. But don't look for any of that from the leaders of Europe. Anyway, this is where I finish my program today. Let me remind you again, you can find all our programs on our various channels, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and subscribe star links under this video. Last but not least, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.